What's up, everybody? We have made translation tech. Autoglosser. This is the first working prototype of Autoglosser. Here's the main point of it. You make or import a sort of translation dictionary that translates single words in one language to words in another language, and it can include pronunciation, and then you load in some text in one language, and the program helps you translate it into another language. We call this step autoglossing when you translate the text word per word, and then the main idea of this is that it's easier to translate the thing into real sentences once you can see the word per word translation, which we call the gloss. And this is for when you want to make an ordinary translation of something, or when you want to make a matching translation that's printed with the gloss and pronunciation. That is just the sort of thing that is maximally useful for language learners. So there's a few different possible use cases for this, and it is coming along now as a product that will soon be very useful for all those. This is the first dev vlog for Autoglosser, and here I'll report on two main topics. One is the development of the program Autoglosser, and the other is the development of the translations I've been making using Autoglosser. Okay, the dev history of Autoglosser in brief. A while ago, long before the first working prototype of Autoglosser, I made a translation of an ancient scroll and presented that in the format of a matching translation visual audiobook, and I did that mostly with WordPad and Photoshop, inefficiently. Then I wrote a short report speculating about a technology that would make that quicker and easier. Then some people joined the Discord wanting to talk about it. And then I made a video 24 minutes long detailing better what it is and why it might matter. And then some more people joined the Discord. And then I made a bigger written specification of features the program could have. And then I made a video 94 minutes long with mock-up demonstrations of all the features and discussions of those. Then some more people joined the Discord, and now we have a handful of real programmers, since apparently that's who my videos get to when I post them, and in this time we've been talking about things like the programming languages and programming language frameworks that this program could be done in, about features and versions, like we're talking about a minimum viable prototype that could be used though with limits, and we're talking about what features an ideal version of this program would have if we built it up a lot more. And now we have that earliest working prototype, and we're doing real testing of it, and we're talking about what features would be best to add next to improve the utility of it incrementally as quickly as possible. And in terms of how this ends up going, it's flexible how closely the product will end up matching that one complete specification, or how different it will be from that. In these early stages of Autoglosser, it's only set up to translate Chinese and other languages that don't use space characters. Well, you could use it to translate something from an alphabetic language, but when you import text, it will treat each letter as one word unit each, and you'll have to click on Join Word many times. But we're testing it on some ancient Chinese scrolls. I've translated the starts of the Laozi, the Zhuangzi, the Liezi, the Wenzi, the Sunzi, and the Mozi. I'll tell you when to pause in a few minutes if you want to read some drafts of those translations. Map mode isn't actually working right now. I showed it working earlier, but whenever you save and then load, it breaks. So I've been doing these in translation mode only, and for all of these I've done in Autoglosser, I've typed in the pronunciation for all the words as far as I've got. For some small part of these, I've also manually glossed all the words, but for now I've mostly left the glosses blank. For example, here in the Zhuangzi, I've typed in glosses just for the uncommon words I wasn't already familiar with. So in the last 3 days, I've typed in well over 1,000 words of pinyin, even when it's the same word that appears 50 times, all with my left hand while selecting all the little text boxes with the mouse in my right hand, and I've translated several dozen lines, and it's going pretty well. So far, my use of Autoglosser has only been slightly more powerful than my old workflow with WordPad, but we do have automatic alignment of the source text and the pronunciation and the gloss, which is way nicer than having those on a series of lines in a word processor. And we have the line break and chunk break system, which keeps everything neat and tidy with always the right number of text fields. Once map mode is working, this will be a lot more powerful than my old workflow, and more features after that will make it even more powerful. Okay, here's what I've noticed in sampling these scrolls. The speed at which I can translate is based on three factors. One is that some of these works are written straightforwardly and some of these are written poetically. Second is that I'm quite familiar with some of these and not others. And third is how good our tech is, which is a matter of developing Autoglosser. On one end of the scale, there's Sunzi, or the art of war. The art of war says what it says plainly, and it has straightforward things to say, and I've already studied it. While the first working prototype of Autoglosser was in dev, I studied this in Chinese and with English translations. I made a complete vocab study list, and I can read 1/3 of it in Chinese only, and the other 2/3 I can read about 80% of the words, but I have my further study of it planned. So it was very quick work to translate the first of 13 sections, and here's my draft translation of the first 7% of the Art of War that you can pause to read if you want. On the other end of this scale, there's the Zhuangzi. The Zhuangzi has subtle things to say, and it says them in florid language. I was translating this with an existing translation for reference, but that was far slower work, and I only just started reading it in Chinese, although I had listened to the audiobooks of English translations of the first 1/3 and a couple of collections of excerpts, like about a dozen times each. For translating Zhuangzi, it would be really helpful to have the two translations format, which I have described and mocked up in that specification of Autoglosser. A direct style translation of Zhuangzi would be fully unreadable. The only good way to do Zhuangzi would be to have the source text, then gloss, then a direct translation, and then a readable translation. Zhuangzi is comparable to Shakespeare, for which translation into English is also best done stepwise like that. So on the two ends of the scale, we have Zhuangzi, which reads like Shakespeare and lends itself to the multiple translation format, and on the other end, Sunzi, which is in a style more like an instruction manual for assembling furniture, and for which the multiple translation format would be redundant. Sunzi is fine to translate in one step with the occasional footnote. On this scale, the 6 works I've sampled would go Sunzi, then Laozi, then Mozi, then Wunzi, then Liezi, then Zhuangzi. Laozi, or the Tao Te Ching, is famously difficult to understand, but it does say what it says plainly, so making a direct translation is very easy. If you've ever read something called a translation of the Tao Te Ching, and it was more than 6,000 words long in English, then that's not a translation, that's an interpretation labeled as a translation. It's also the first or second most translated book in all of human history, with roughly as many translations as the Bible. A real translation of it is less than 6,000 words long, and it's only difficult because accepting it means surrendering your life to the cold indifference of fate, which people generally find difficult, but the language is easy. This was also quick work because I've listened to the audiobooks of translations probably more than a dozen times, and also listened to the matching translation with the Chinese and the Lega translation, which is not great but not terrible, also about a dozen times. On the other end of the scale, next to the Zhuangzi, is the Liezi. Translating Liezi would be maybe best with the 2 translation format, or maybe the 1 translation format, depending on which style you want to end up with. That's roughly where I would put the border for what's best done with the 2 translation format and what's best done with the 1 translation format. The wording in Chinese is not exactly plain, and I've only listened to the audiobook of the English translation about a dozen times, and just a few days ago starting to get acquainted with the original Chinese. And I mentioned in the first video that I would only be willing to read the Zhuangzi or the Liezi in a matching translation format, but I should have also said at the same time that I would quite like to make the first matching glossed translation with appropriate tech, which would be a version of Autoglosser just slightly more powerful than what we have now. Wunzi, I translated the first whole scroll of before Autoglosser, and that was that thing that gave me the idea for Autoglosser, but I haven't started porting my translation into Autoglosser and adding a gloss. Mozi I've only done a tiny amount of and never really read before. All of these are highly influential works and also things I have existing English translations of for reference. In short, I've tested the first working prototype of Autoglosser with 6 ancient works, and although we only have the first few features of Autoglosser, there's now a lot more confirmation that further versions will be excellent for this base of operations starting in ancient Chinese. Now that I've sampled these, I'll pivot my attention to those works I know best, and that are in the plainest language, Sunzi and Laozi, and then go on to the other ones after I've done those. After those, I should probably be able to translate almost anything on ctext without existing translations for reference. But I am just as interested in making glossed translations of those 6 for the purpose of making it way easier for other people to develop their language skill for ancient Chinese, and that would make it about 50 times easier for other people to join this effort. Okay, altogether, Sunzi is about 2 scrolls long, and I've translated 7% of it in the last 3 days. Laozi is 1 scroll long, and I've translated 11% of it in the last 3 days. Muozi is about 11 scrolls long, and I've only translated about 0.5% of it in the last 3 days. Wunzi is 12 scrolls long, and I've translated 8% of it 2 years ago. Liezi is about 8 scrolls long, and I've translated 2% of it in the last 3 days. And here's a draft of most of that portion that you can pause to read if you want. And Zhuangzi is about 14 scrolls long, and I've translated 2% of it in the last 3 days. And here's a draft of most of that portion that you can pause to read if you want. New joiners are welcome, especially people who are real programmers, and especially those programmers who donate programming work to make programs that are made free to use. Once Autoglosser has more features, it will be set up for translating alphabetic languages, and I'm also interested in starting a translation of Chaucerian Middle English once that's up. The earliest program versions of Autoglosser are in Flutter. We're not yet decided on how to proceed in the long run. It's possible that the thing to do is keep improving and prototyping in Flutter until the user experience is refined and the set of features is fully designed and tested, and then maybe port that into C++ or Rust. We have one guy in our club who has done real industry professional translation, and he says that he could make an optimized version in C++ that could handle a text in translation mode the size of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and a map the size of all of C Edict, all without lag, and that such a program could be installed on a computer and then run for a decade without needing updates. He says that a version of Autoglosser geared that way could be an industry standard for translation work of almost all languages. Anyone interested in that side of things, please join. Anyone who can program collaboratively on the present Flutter version, also please join. A link to the Discord is in the description, and please send links to this video to any of your friends who might be able to help with programming, or any of your friends who might want to use this for translating, and I mean translating from any language to any other language, ancient or modern works. Alright, that's dev vlog number 1 for Autoglosser. I'll report again later about how the technology comes along and the translations, and about whether we get a community of programmers and translators together.